Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is From Principles to Practice, Addressing Caste and Advancing Non-Discrimination in Supply Chains, a side session of the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Sector. My name is Andrea Ackerman, and I'm the Director for Civil Society Engagement at the Fair Labor Association. The Fair Labor Association, or FLA, is an international network that brings together the voices of companies, civil society organizations and unions, and universities who collaborate to improve business policies and practices to ensure that millions of people working at the world's factories and farms are paid fairly and protected from risks to their health, safety, and well-being. FLA has been partnering with our civil society member Arisa, as well as the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights and the International Dalit Solidarity Network to shed light on the problem of discrimination and exploitation faced by workers from caste-affected communities. As for why we put together today's discussion, discrimination based on caste remains a prevalent issue in garment and footwear supply chains, and it's often the root of other egregious labor rights violations, such as forced labor and child labor. Caste can be a sensitive topic for companies to address within their supply chain, so it's critical for companies to understand how caste-based discrimination manifests in their supply chains so that they can identify and address these risks. Non-discrimination at work is a fundamental labor standard outlined in FLA's Fair Labor Code, which defines labor standards for companies and their suppliers aiming to achieve decent work. Our standard on non-discrimination entails that no person shall be subject to any form of discrimination in employment, including on the basis of gender, race, religion, age, disability, sexual orientation, nationality, political opinion, social group, or ethnic origin. As caste is deeply entrenched in a deeply systemic issue in certain areas and a sensitive topic, special measures should be put into place to prevent discrimination within a company's operations in caste-affected communities. So this discussion today is meant to elevate this important issue and provide participants with knowledge and resources on the topic of caste so that employers and their supply chain partners can better identify and counter caste-based discrimination and uphold fundamental human rights at work. So with that said, thanks again to all of our speakers and our attendees today. I will quickly note that this webinar is publicly available as a side session of the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Sector. So we are therefore recording this webinar. However, we want to recognize the sensitive nature of this topic. So we ask that this discussion and anything shared not be attributed to a specific speaker without their permission. And please treat information shared today with the utmost discretion and respect for our civil society contributors here today. This webinar will be more of a discussion amongst our speakers who are dedicated experts on the topic of caste and its impact on workers. So I'll first go ahead and introduce our speakers. We're joined by Bina Palakal. Ms. Palakal is the General Secretary of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. And over the last 15 years, she's worked with NCDHR working on Dalit economic rights with a focus on economic justice and gender equity. We're also joined by Meena Varma. Meena is the Executive Director of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, or IDSN. And until 2021, she was also the Director of the Dalit Solidarity Network UK. IDSN works on the global level to help eliminate caste discrimination and similar forms of discrimination based on work and descent. They link grassroots priorities with international mechanisms and institutions in order to change policies and practices that lead to caste discrimination. And finally, we're also joined by Sandra Claassen. Sandra is director at Arisa, a Dutch NGO working to address labor rights violations in global supply chains in South Asia. In collaboration with South Asian civil society organizations, Arisa monitors working conditions in sectors such as garment and textiles, natural stone, and vegetable seeds. Their priorities are the most vulnerable workers in issues such as child labor, forced labor, and gender and caste-based discrimination. As for the structure of today's webinar, we'll first learn from our speakers about caste systems and their intersections with work, and importantly, how workers are impacted by caste. We'll then hear some examples of how caste manifests in cotton, leather, and garment supply chains. And we'll hear recommendations for companies on how they can better recognize and address the risk of caste-based discrimination. We also want this to be an interactive discussion with participants, so the Q&A box is available for any comments or questions. Feel free to insert those anonymously or not, whatever your preference, but please use the Q&A box because the chat will be disabled, and that's because of the large number of attendees. So please use the Q&A box only, and we'll keep an eye on that. And I'll be sure to share my contact information at the end of the conversation. In case there are any questions remaining after the discussion, you can get in touch with me. So I want to go ahead and get started with our discussion. And so we'll specifically start with understanding caste and its interlinkages with work. So I want to start with you, Bina, on the history of caste and the Dalit reality, and then I'll shift to Mina, where we really move into the supply chain conversation and why this is important in the workplace. So Bina, can you please start the conversation with an overview of caste and its impact on the daily lives and realities at work for Dalit people? And can you also share some background on the historical links between caste, occupation, and exclusion? Bina, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And it's great to share the panel with you, Sandra, and Mina. And great to have so many participants so excited to share the work that we do, all of us collectively. Caste is, they say, a 3,000-year-old form of a system that was created, basically a system of hierarchy that was created where one over the other oppresses the other, just in very simple terms. But they've created this structure where you have four major castes. You have a lot of subcastes within these castes. And the four major categories are on the top are the people who are the temple priests. So they get to become temple priests. Nobody else is allowed to be the temple priest. And then second, you have the warriors. The third, you have businesses, so all the people who own businesses. And below that, you have artisans or people who work with iron, etc. So these are the four major castes. And these four major castes have, different castes within them. But these four major castes are known as the touchable castes, which means that, yes, there is a lot of discrimination between these castes, but they are not untouchables. Outside of this caste is the Dalit community, which is known as the outcasts or formerly known as untouchables. I come from that community where we are not allowed to eat food, intermarry with the four upper castes. There's a lot of violence on us. And each of this caste is divided or based on a certain work that they do. And that's where the whole connection with work happens. So priests, businesses, artisans, warriors, but the people outside of this caste or outcaste are supposed to do all so-called work that is polluting or dirty. So keeping the streets, it's quite ironic because we keep the streets clean, but we are known as the polluters because they think that because we're keeping the streets clean and because we're doing all the sanitation work, almost 90% of the sanitation work are done by Dalits and also the indigenous population, but mostly by Dalits. So all the so-called dirty work that's so going down the drains, you see people going down, sewerage and drain without any kind of protective gear, without even a mask. They go inside to clean, unclog. All the sweeping and cleaning of toilets is done by us. All the cleaning of dead carcass and picking up, bodies, dead bodies are done by us. So a lot of this work that is considered unclean is that's where the whole aspect of work comes in, that we are divided based on the work that we do. And because we are doing all the sanitation work and because we're doing so-called the dirty work, many people don't like to sit with the Dalits and eat food with them, for example, or in daily life manifestations, don't want to get married to the community. If there is an intermarriage, there's always a violence that happens. Or they don't want to, invite them over to their house if they go there, to stand outside, to an extent where even today, if there is a woman or a man who's working in somebody's farm land or field and is asking for money or water, even today they don't give water in the same glass. They give another glass, or they pour the water in your hand and then you have to drink it from your hand. This was the system 3,000 years old. The forms have changed since then, but it still continues. And this system is sanctioned by religion. And so people have more fear that, okay, because it is sanctioned by religion, it must be the right thing to do. It must be right to have people, who are below us, and they sanction it by saying that everybody has a role to play, and this is your role. So, you continue to do this. In terms of how that plays out, when it comes to actual factories or companies, always the lower tier jobs or down supply chain. I think Meena will explain it more, but just to introduce it, mostly in the supply chain, mostly the work is done by people from these communities. And where it's hard labor work is done, hazardous work, where they have to pick up hazardous garbage, or take care of hazardous material, is done by people from these communities. So any work that the rest of the society does not want to get involved in is practically done by the Dalit community. And therefore, when we talk about supply chains, without talking about caste and gender and the implications of this, because I know Sandra will talk about the garment industry, that mostly there are women, and almost all the women are from this specific community. So I think it's really important that when we're talking about the larger human rights situation within businesses, we have to look at caste, at least in this region, not just in India, but this region. One more point, and then I will stop. Is that while we see that caste is very prevalent in South Asia, it is also prevalent within the communities who migrate from South Asia into other countries, whether it's US, whether it's Europe. You also find similar forms of, I know that many companies here will have branches in Africa, Europe, many other countries. So similar forms of discrimination is seen among the Roma community, for example, in Europe, or the Haratin in Africa, or Quilombola in Latin America. And the larger sort of a term by the UN is work and descent. So people come under the discrimination based on work and descent. So I will pause here and then end the time out.
Thanks, Bina. I mean, that's a great segue to what I want to talk about next. I would love to hear from you, and then also from Mina, around these intersecting vulnerabilities. So, you mentioned, obviously, women are affected by caste discrimination. Workers who cross, country lines are affected by caste discrimination. So can you speak a little bit to how these intersecting vulnerabilities, such as gender and migration status, impact caste-affected communities and their livelihoods?
So recently we visited a recycling plant in a place very close to Delhi. Delhi, you all know, is the capital of this country, and you would think that things are so much better. And they're recycling all the clothes from globally, from all over the world, that is coming here to India, and then they recycle. If you just look at it in one go, it's nice. We're recycling, it's good that they're recycling old clothes. People are getting to wear, I mean, old clothes are recycling, people are getting to wear it, and they have several different uses for it. But then there's this huge go down that has no fans. I mean, maybe one fan, and like it'll be like huge in the sense, huge means at least 200 people can sit there, but it's filled with clothes. It's just maybe like 5 or 6 kilometers. I don't know how to say what, but it's like a three-story building. Let's just say like a three-story building. That's how high the clothes are. And in the middle of these stacks of clothes are women sitting without any kind of support mechanism. There are no toilets, maybe one toilet for like, I don't know how many women. So no access to toilets. These women are sitting from morning, they come and they leave in the evening, and they get a minimum of 200 rupees, which is less than $5 a day. And this 200 rupees has to be divided between them and the middleman who is actually, bringing them for this employment. And they're not allowed to take leave. If they take leave, then they're not allowed to, then the salary is cut. So it's not like they can take a number of leaves. So there are many things. One, there's a lot of exploitation and sexual harassment from, because most of, not just in this recycling plant, but just in general. And there is no redressal mechanism. There is a good practice that probably later we can come to in Tamil Nadu, but there's no redressal mechanism. Most of the women are at the mercy of the person who is there as their supervisor, and because the supervisor is almost always from a dominant caste, so he thinks that he can treat the women how he wants to treat. Um, uh, it's almost like a bonded labor, because they don't give them minimum wages, and this is not just for the women but for the men as well. The minimum wages, but for women it's more worse, because they treat them, there is a lot of mistreatment sexually. And second, there are absolutely men, they say they can go anywhere and relieve themselves, so to speak. That's what they say. But for women, there is no specific toilets for women that they can use. There is no facilities where, if they're going through menstruation, can have a facility to go to. And many times they get sick, but they're scared to go to the hospital, because then that is also another extra expense that they have. So many times the conditions that are there are not conducive, or does not follow the minimum labor standards, I would say.
Yeah, it sounds like there's very little access to remedy for those workers. Mina, I'd love to hear from you, if there's anything you want to share, about these intersecting, vulnerabilities and how caste impacts that. Um, would love to hear from you, and then, would also love to then shift the focus to really think about, how this manifests in supply chains.
Thank you, Andrea and Bina, for setting the scene so eloquently as normal. I just want to start with kind of a quote from one of our Dalit human rights defenders. Her name's Moni Rani Das, and she's from our network in Bangladesh. And she really sums up the root of this problem in one sentence. If you are not considered human, human rights do not apply to you. And this is just as we see with systemic racism, caste discrimination is also fueled by both conscious and unconscious bias, which is why we refer to it as a hidden apartheid. And it's like an invisible system of segregation that most people just don't want to talk about. And this often includes suppliers in the global supply chains. As you said, Andrea, it's very sensitive, but people's sensitivities need to be overcome now. I think in a supply chain setting, it means the opportunities and protections that other workers may avail of are simply not available to Dalit workers. And the types of marginalization severely limits sources of income for Dalits and makes them much more vulnerable to labor exploitation, and in particular, as Bina pointed out, to bonded and forced labor. I think caste and gender discrimination exacerbates that risk of gender-based violence and harassment, exploitation of workers. And as they said, forced labor, workers are exploited and harassed just simply on the basis of their caste. And it's seen as the norm, both as direct employees or, as we are trying to highlight more and more, as auxiliary employees, such as cleaners. I mean, Bina pointed out about sort of manual scavenging, but cleaners and sanitation workers are always going to be Dalits when you're looking at the factory and the supply chain setting. So they're often overlooked when it comes to due diligence and audits. We really do need to be looking at moving beyond audit. I mean, discrimination is often overlooked in audits. So I think, for Dalits, they are the invisible workers. and at very high risk of forced labor and hazardous work. I mean, some of the sectors, and I know Sandra's going to go into this in much more detail. You know, leather is directly tied to caste in South Asia, as handling dead animals and skins is a traditional caste-based occupation forced on Dalit workers, and garment factories. Cases of sexual abuse and harassment are rampant among Dalit women garment workers. Their access to remedy and grievance mechanisms is generally severely compromised. We will come into sort of some of the solutions, I hope, a little bit later on, because you know we are working very closely with people, especially in South India, to try and address this. I mean, but also in the garment sector, work such as hand sewing, embroidery, embellishments, that's often outsourced to home-based workers, and they are so under the radar. And you know, they, I think, many of whom are Dalit women who face exploitation. And because they're under the radar, they don't, you know, there's no such thing as a minimum wage. There's no access to health or social service benefits. As I mentioned, auxiliary workers, very recently, cleaners and sanitation workers in factories and the garment, textile, and leather supply chains will be Dalits, and they again are overlooked by global brands in their due diligence. And it is often a service outsourced by even by the factories themselves. So there becomes a further layer and a further layer and a further layer. I think there are very strong historical links between caste and cleaning. So therefore making Dalits extremely high risk of forced labor and dangerous work in this sector. I think Bina pointed out the fact that Dalits are often lowered into sewers to unblock them without any protection, without any masks, without, there's no sort of contracts or anything like that. It's automatically assumed. I just wanted to check with Bina, are you talking about Panipat? I don't know if that's near Delhi yes, because I think one of the things
Yes.
thank you, because one of the things I actually wanted to mention is that you know, Dalit women and girls also work in the cottonseed and cotton fields, supplying cotton for global brands. So, you know, we really need to be looking as far down the supply chain as we can go. And I know that's a huge issue. I know the supply, the first tier is the one that most people are focused on. But, you know, I can't say enough times, you know, when we're looking at business, when we're looking at brands, caste in South Asia in particular is a very salient risk, and you're never ever going to be able to meet your due diligence requirements if you don't look at caste in your supply chains. I mean, I think the recycled textile hubs you were talking about, again, you talked about forced labor, hazardous work, high risk of gender-based violence and harassment. I think, what struck me was the Guardian's report about these human rights abuses in this recycling hub in India, which was released last year. And it's a chilling reminder that human rights must be central to responsible business practice. At the moment, it's just an afterthought. So, you know, I just feel that we need to be much more focused. And as I say, you know, when we're looking at brands can open doors that we can't. And I think it's important that they start to use that leverage and they start to open those doors and ask the hard questions a bit more. So let me kind of stop there, because I think, you know, Sandra will be able to give you a lot more detail about what's happening in some of the supply chains that they've done such excellent work on. So thank you. I hope that was enough of an overview of some of the areas that we're looking at.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. I mean, that was such a powerful quote. If you're not considered human, human rights do not apply to you. We know we have to secure the rights of the most vulnerable workers because everyone benefits. And we have to look at the realities for informal workers and supply chains as well. So I want to continue on this. Sandra, I want to hear from you. Arisa has done a lot of research in this area, and I'd love to hear from you, you know, your thoughts on how caste manifests in cotton, textile, garment, and footwear, as well as leather supply chains. Anything you'd like to share from your research and insights, would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Bina and Mina, for pointing out the framework as such and already giving a lot of examples of what is happening. And I think with this session, that is the first thing we want to achieve, to have the information, because the information is key to act afterwards. So as you said, Andrea, we, as Arisa, together with South Asian researchers, have done a lot of research on labor rights violations and tried to address the caste topic in these researches. And in the last couple of years, we have also tried to do the research from a caste angle from the start, because one thing is that what we see is that labor rights are being violated, and the majority of the workers is from caste oppressed communities, are Dalits, like in South Indian garment sector, for example. And then what has already been shown is that they are the most affected when it comes to forced labor situations, for example. But at the same time, also discriminatory practices take place. That's based on what Bina has already been shared, the idea of being a community that is seen as not clean, etc. So there are discriminatory practices happening in the factories, in the spinning mills, in the hostels where workers are being held, where there is a separation between the place where in the canteen where people can sit, Dalit workers will sit in another place, cannot use the same water tap points, have to sit or in the back of the bus instead of wherever they want, or have to even stand in the transport situation. So those are like also very specific discriminatory practices that take place in addition to the labor rights violations that are there. At the same time, we are talking about India, but we're not talking only about India. We have been doing some research also in Pakistan about the garment industry. There you see the same situation, that the people who clean the factory's premises are from Dalit background. So that's also happening there. We will be doing more research into the cotton production industry in Pakistan in the coming period, because there we also heard that it's a lot of Dalits working in cotton production, and that those that information comes already out of what Meena was saying about cotton seed and cotton production in India. In Gujarat, for example, we have seen examples about a so-called sharecropping, wage sharecropping system, where workers, they work with an advancement that they receive in the beginning, and then they are paid with a share in the harvest. But that share in the harvest many times is not enough to cover the advance, what that has already been received, and that makes a vicious circle of debt bondage, and therefore also a form of forced labor. So those are already some examples. Bina and Meena shared already the example from the leather industry, where Dalits are very much overrepresented in taking care of the hides at the first start of the supply chain. They work in leather tanneries, dangerous, hazardous work and conditions. So there is a lot of things going on, and I think it's really important that we all have this information, so that from there we can see what we can do to improve the conditions. Let's leave it there for now.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I definitely agree. And for our next portion, we'll focus on what companies can do. I do see some questions coming in the Q&A box. Please feel free to keep putting your questions there. We will have dedicated time for questions and answers from the audience. For now, I want to stay on this thread, Sandra, that you started talking about, which is that caste is not just a one sector problem and it's not isolated to India. Bina, and then Mina, I would love to hear from both of you if there are any kind of insights, from, the ground, any kind of field level research or insights that you all would like to share, that really help demonstrate the fact that this is not solely a one sector or one country issue.
So, yes, caste is not only present in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. The caste is across these five countries. But like I said, a lot of population from these countries also migrate. So they kind of take caste with them. So in the US, caste is now such a big conversation. There's a big conversation around caste and having caste as a protected categories in universities, companies, etc. I think the conversation is also there in the United Kingdom. I know there's a lot of conversation around the equality law, and so these conversations are there broadly, but it's there because this is so prevalent in the communities that are affected by it in South Asia. So similar systems and similar labor standards also are there in Nepal, for example, or in Pakistan, for example. All sanitation workers are from the Dalit community because caste is so prevalent. In Sri Lanka, it's a little bit different. They're mostly plantation workers, people who were taken as migrants from India for working on plantation, and they hardly have housing, access to housing, they hardly have. But the manifestations are maybe a little different, but they're all because of caste. And in Bangladesh, I think we all have read enough stories about the garment industry in Bangladesh and the tragedies that have happened over the last few years. So I think this is not, but I also want to say that this is not just here. It's with the Roma community in or the Quilombola in Latin America. It's across globally in different names, but the structure of caste and how that operates and the manifestations remain the same. And therefore, we cannot just limit it to India. But I must say that India does have some kind of good legal mechanisms, though it's not implemented well. So that's the other side of it, that while there are legal mechanisms to address some of these repercussions of caste, there's a special act to address violence against people from the Dalit community. Very good legislation. There's a budgetary allocation for employment, for education, etc. But these policies are not implemented. So it's as good as not having a policy almost, But there are much better mechanisms in India than in the other countries in South Asia.
Thanks, Bina. That's really helpful. And you're absolutely right. The policy is no good without actually being able to implement it. Mina, I want to turn to you. I would like to see if there's anything that you want to add, on how caste manifests across sectors, and across the region. And then we'll kind of turn our focus a little bit more to the audit and compliance focused conversation. Go ahead, Mina.
Thank you. I mean, again, I'm just going to give you a quote because this is from Dr. Aidan McQuaid, who's the former director of Anti-Slavery International, and he's actually an IDSN ambassador. And when we were working together, when I was running DSN UK and he was at Anti-Slavery International, he basically said caste is the single biggest enabler of labor exploitation and modern slavery in all of South Asia. And we should take note of that because not only is caste the biggest enabler of exploitation and slavery, it really is now beholden on companies and brands, especially these people we have with us today, which I'm delighted to recognize the real and salient risk at every level of the supply chain. And, Andrea, we talked about this, but there are labor standards. There's the FLA, there's the ETI, there's the ILO. These cover the minimum standards of labor care, frankly. And Dalits are always disproportionately affected by violations of that code. And we talked about kind of intersectional discrimination, which is also a root enabler of human rights abuses, frankly, in supply chains and elsewhere. When you're looking at caste and gender, this is one of the enablers of some of the worst human rights abuses in global supply chains. But you couple this with profit-driven demand and production cycles, that just incentivizes cheap labor, and it becomes a toxic recipe for exploitation. So those who are most affected, such as Dalit women, they often have little or no bargaining power because they have little or no alternatives to accepting whatever deal that they are given. And I think it's important also to look at purchasing practices, because these are often an overlooked but key element, addressing systems that really underpin the exploitation. And I think, when you're looking at the various areas and the various sectors, I've already mentioned, and we are talking about it, but it's leather, there's garments, there's cleaners and sanitation workers, there's home workers, there's agricultural workers, there's recycled textile workers. And I think that's where, we really need to look at. And also, as I mentioned previously, we need to look at audits and their effectiveness or not. And I'm sure Sandra will have quite a bit to say about that as well.
Yeah, let's stay on that thread, because we know, so many of what you just mentioned, so many of those jobs are informal, and we know that audits hardly ever capture the risks that informal workers are facing day to day. So Sandra, I want to hear from you, would love to hear your thoughts specifically on, the limits around audits and kind of these standard compliance tools that folks within the human rights due diligence space really utilize. Mina, I saw your hand, so if you want to jump in. Okay. All right, Sandra, we'll go for you, focusing on this question on the limitations of audits. But then Mina and Bina, if you have anything to add on this specifically, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, please add on to what I'm saying, and thanks for raising that, Mina. I think it is nowadays we have an industry when it comes to garment and footwear, which is the main sector for this OECD forum. There is a culture of audits and of compliance, and we see that more and more of. Luckily, there's more and more discussion on the habit of doing audits, and from there conclude that things are okay. And what you already mentioned, Andrea, the idea of check the box, which is like the more or less inherent to the audit, because it is about compliance. So it is about checking boxes and see where if things are fine. So I liked the fact that it's that criticism is very much on the compliance nature of an audit instead of looking towards improvement. So when you have a business, it is about improving. It's not about being perfect, because no one is perfect. So no business is perfect, but it is about getting there. So to look for improvement means that you have to look for things that are not going well. And an audit as such is looking at what is going well and not about what is not going well, because it is about compliance. And if I have enough boxes, then I will comply. And when you really want to look, and discrimination, it is a really difficult topic to identify in general. So let alone in a short period of time that you can do an audit, because therefore you have to be able to talk to workers, for example, but also to observe certain. So you have to be kind of aware about things that could happen when it comes to 2 water tap points, for example, because why do you have 2 and not 1? You have to know that's a possibility of a discriminatory practice that can happen at a workplace. And I think when it comes to workers' voice, that is key in hearing about specific situations of discrimination, but workers to speak out Mina expressed it already with the quote that she started with. When you don't believe that you can speak out, you will not speak out. So then an auditor can never hear, especially when it is interviews at the workplace. Then it will be very difficult for workers to speak out. So I think, and there's also a question in the chat or in the Q&A about, but it's such a sensitive issue. You cannot ask people's caste just like that. Then it is very much, I think, about realizing that this topic is a salient risk and it will be there. And then it is about improving the situation, because you start from the idea that it is there. And then from there you can take specific steps to improve a situation for workers, and start from there. And then you do not even need to ask a worker's caste background, for example. So I think that the whole discussion about going beyond auditing is very important, and it's also very much important for this topic that we are discussing here. And I guess, Mina, you will have additional arguments for that as well.
Yeah, Bina, Mina, feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Bina.
Yes, I mean, nothing further much to add, but I would think that, when people say that it's a sensitive issue, like all the issues that considers, like if we're talking about race, it was a sensitive issue. When we talk about women's rights 40 years ago, it was a sensitive issue, right? So I think that cannot be for us an excuse to say because it is a sensitive issue that we don't want to deal with it. I think it should be very clear that because it is an issue, it's a sensitive issue. It is an issue. So we have to accept that and find ways of, I think when we move to the session where we talk about strategies, we can all share what are those different strategies. But I think conversation is very important. There was a case where Mina and several of us were also involved in where, this young girl was raped and murdered in a factory, and they were suppliers to very big, very big companies in the UK and in Europe. And had they had conversations with these women to say how safe the environment was, what are the issues that we are facing on a periodic level as one compliance, to say that, okay, keep it as one compliance, of course, audit is there. But in addition to that, have these conversations so women would have shared that there is a threat to their life, or this is going on, or maybe have a secret, ballot where they can put in chits to say that, what are the issues. So some of these issues can, I think, because they don't want to make the issue a bigger issue and, to deal with it, they just, hush it all under the carpet until they find out that somebody was killed, for it. So I think some of these preventive measures can be taken by companies. And I always see this, and I'm sorry, there are so many companies in the room, but I'd like to say it at the risk of them hating me, that we follow such high standards, labor standards in the northern countries, Europe, US. So when it comes to countries like India, we're okay not to follow those high standards of labor because, it's okay. We don't need to follow that. So I think it's worth thinking why we don't want to follow those same high standards also in countries like India and other countries where some of these companies are operating.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, audits are one tool in the toolbox for understanding workers' experiences, but they're extremely limited, right? They certainly have gaps, and we have to deploy other tools and approaches as well, which I want to get into. Mina, do you want to jump in really quickly, and then we'll kind of shift to some of the recommendations for companies?
Well, I was going to kind of shift to that.
Perfect.
In a way.
Let's get started then, because I think that's what everyone is here
I think
for.
what Bina has said is really pertinent. Doing the work that we do, we cannot just swerve the hard questions. Otherwise, what's the point of doing the work that we do, right? So if we are prepared to face those hard questions head on with our limited resources, with our limited stuff, all sorts of resources, then those that have better resources than us ought to be able to face some of these things head on and stop shrugging their shoulders and say, oh, well, what do you want us to do about it? We want you to do something, for God's sake, get on with it, get moving. And I think one of those, that Venus just said, she spoke about the case in South India, but one of the things is about engaging the workers proactively, create the safe spaces that are truly inclusive and make sure whoever is engaging with them really listens. I mean, and you can use trusted community anchored, maybe NGOs. I know that's controversial, but also, trade unions to help facilitate. And at the same time, we need to work from the outset that the understanding that the communities can be strong, and Dalit women are strong and resilient. And when they are presented with their own appropriate space, tools, possibilities to demand their rights, then there is no one better to have a potential impact to do this than the women themselves. And we have to get to the perspectives of active involvement of the most marginalized and at-risk workers in order to help mitigate some of these problems. We need to, as I said, we need to talk to them, we need to be hearing them, listening and acting. And I think it's really important to facilitate that engagement. I did see something about, locally appointed auditors and people saying about not being able to ask about caste. You can guarantee that people know what your caste is. I mean, in the amount of times in the UK that people have said, oh, where are you from? And then I kind of go South London and they do that. Where are you really from? Or where are your parents from? Or where are your people just know, and if those people are allowed to ask the questions, why aren't we? Why aren't we allowed to ask the questions that will unpick the fundamental human rights abuses that are going on? And as I said, creating those safe spaces that are inclusive will vary depending on the context. I have spoke a lot about Dalit women, but we are talking about other Dalit workers. When you're talking about sanitation workers, manual scavengers that are being lowered into the sanitation sewers, then they are mostly men, although there are women that are cleaning human feces in also the most degrading of ways. And I think we have to acknowledge the unique obstacles to grievance mechanisms and other safeguards that are meant to protect marginalized workers such as women, Dalit women and Dalits face. So we need to kind of think of ways, again, it's going to be difficult, but who cares? Opportunities for workers to organize themselves, to strengthen their voices and to know what their rights are and be able to demand those rights. I think this is fundamental because if you don't know what your rights are, how do you know what your rights are, if that makes sense? You need to be able to ask for them. You need to be able to demand safe spaces, fair wages, decent conditions, hazardous work, and no child labor. Come on, let's move forward. Let's really work on this. So that's one of the starting points on solutions.
Yeah, I think this is a great starting point and it's a really important one, and I want to stay on it. I think a lot of people have heard the saying, nothing about us without us. You have to engage women, you have to engage workers, you have to engage Dalit communities, when you're trying to understand and learn about these issues and remediate harm. So I want to stick on this question for a minute because it is so critical. Meaningful engagement with rights holders, with civil society, particularly with unions when they exist in a factory setting. This is so important. And so can you all kind of speak to this a little bit more? What does good rights holder engagement entail for companies who are seeking to address, this issue of non-discrimination within their supply chains? Sandra, maybe we'll start with you and then we can go back to you, Bina.
Yeah, I think this is key to really engage, and then the term meaningful is very important. Just to have contact is not enough. It needs to be meaningful in the sense that you need to really want to listen, and you really need to really want to hear what people are saying. And there are different ways of doing so. So what Mina has already shared about safe spaces within work settings, for example, or then create safe spaces, and that sometimes will mean outside of the work setting, so that people can feel even more safe to speak out. And at the same time, it's about engaging with organizations that are there in the communities, in the country where, or in the region where you're operating, and that's an important topic. And you will need to it will not be like that they are there just knocking the door. You will need to find them, and you will need to go and look for them and talk to different organizations, because there are also different organizations out there, and not all have the same information, have the same background. So especially when it is about the topic of caste, you need to speak to organizations who represent the caste affected communities, who are the caste affected communities as such. So I think that is really important there. And I guess, Bina, you must have some specific experience about engaging with companies that might be useful for the audience as well.
Yeah, so many times when we approach companies, to be really honest, and I'm being brutally honest here, that people in India don't want to discuss it. Because if you have to discuss it, that means you also have to look inward to see your privilege and, to see, so giving up space, and they don't want to do it. So it's very, very difficult to talk to companies in India, especially if the managers are of Indian origin and not, so it's difficult. So one of the tricks that we use is that we go through their head office. So we talk to either the Asia Pac office or to the global lead team to see and tell them that this context is there, and, can we have a conversation? And always it comes through successfully if we go through their Asia Pac office. And one of the reasons people don't want to discuss this is also it's too political, it's too sensitive. People will, the others, like the dominant caste will be hurt. They will not like this conversation. But the point is that we are not creating an issue. We are only discussing an issue that is already there. And how do we make that issue better? If I, as a human being, is seeing somebody else treated badly, it is in the interest of even me to ensure that that person is not, right? So that they don't get it. So I think one of the things that we suggest always is have more conversations with people who are in the lower tier, where, what are the issues that they can, what are the mechanisms that we can put in place if there is a discrimination. All the time, if you visit, I'm sure many of you must have visited, like if you go to some construction site, or if you go to some where they're the brick kilns, you'll always see that women are doing the work and their babies will be in a little cloth, they tie across two trees. But if you had provided a small shed or a small, place where they can bring their babies to the creche, there'll be more women who are willing to do it, because it gives them a little bit more respect than putting. Sometimes I have seen they put them in a basket and leave them, in the side of the construction site while they're doing this. Now, the point is that if you had spoken to her and if you had asked some of them that what is the best way, that how would they feel respected, we also think that it is, for us, it is a big deal is about dignity. That, it has to also be dignified, the space safe, secure, and dignified, so that we don't continue to use those oppressive practices, So if that had happened, a creche facility for women who are working there, more women would come out into the labor force. More women would think, okay, this is a dignified way of doing it. So I think stakeholder engagement with the community is very important. As far as it's a sensitive topic, yes, it's a sensitive topic. There are different ways of doing it. We don't have to ask people's caste directly, but we can. There are like, for example, in bigger companies, what we have suggested is we have suggested for people to at least know how many people in their companies are from a certain caste, for example. So what we have said is you can just ask them to put their caste in a little box without putting their name, so that at least they have a number, of they have a diversity index to say that how many are women, how many are which caste. And then if they think that there is nobody from an oppressed caste, then try to have mechanisms where you can bring in people, recruit them, train them. I mean, in my organization, we have about 60, 70, almost 90% of the staff are from the community. When we ask other organizations why you don't have, they say, we can't find anybody qualified, no? But then you have to find them and start training them and say, okay, I'll give a little bit. If I have 10 staff, one staff can be from this community. I think it's important to have that. And I think one of the most important things that I would suggest a strategy is that we have to have sensitization workshops to the companies who are having the subsidiaries here, not just for people here, but if X company is a Norway-based company that is opening a branch here, we need to have those workshops. And I'm dreading, because India just signed the free trade agreement with Europe, and billions of dollars is going to come in, a lot of jobs, which is great. I'm not against it. But then with that comes a lot of other issues, and especially human rights violations. And so I think that more and more we have to ensure that we have sensitization workshops at all levels, including the global heads, so that they know that this is the local context and how they can take that local context take it into context, so that they can have some mechanisms in place to ensure that they have both look at the supply chains and whether there is any discrimination. And the other thing is, if there's a dominant manager who's from the dominant community, most of the contracts he will give to people of his community. He will not. So can there be at least 5% from these companies, from the supply chain, whether they're buying smaller products, to be bought from, smaller organizations, or smaller, how do I even say, nano industries that are selling these small parts that are owned by people from these communities. I think some of those things we can definitely work, if any company is interested, with them on building this policy of inclusion.
Thank you, Veena. I mean, you mentioned such a crucial point, which is that companies and employers have to give up space or give up some of their power to acknowledge and address these issues, and to address them in an appropriate and a safe way. And safety and fear of retaliation is a huge concern. So, companies have to engage themselves directly with civil society, with unions, and with communities. And they have to really build trust with these communities in order to be able to identify a path forward together. So I'd love to hear from all of you, really, are there examples you can share of how companies have really built the internal awareness and capacity to be able to address these issues, and to really focus on that trust building that has to happen with workers and their representative organizations in their supply chain, so that the company can really address these issues in partnership with the supplier. Would love to hear from all of you on that. Meena, why don't we start with you?
Well, one of the things, and I think this also answers one of the questions, is that when there was the death of the young worker in the factory in Tamil Nadu, it was a Dalit women's led trade union that negotiated for a change in the working practices, and they what is now being called the historic Dindigul Agreement came in to that factory, which was mandatory around anti-sexual harassment and gender-based violence. Now, if that can be actually taken and spread across all of those supply chains, all of those suppliers, then we're looking at a good first step. There are good practices there. It's not just in not just in India. I mean, Bina's mentioned other countries, and I think there was one also around gender-based violence and sexual harassment in Africa. We have good practice examples out there. So why cannot we just take them? And I think, one of the questions which says multiple times trade union leaders also belong to the upper caste, absolutely they do. So we need to break that. And as I said, it's about being much more inclusive. I mean, everybody, we're not talking even about positive action or reservation, the worst word in the world as far as many people are concerned in the Indian context. We're talking about the right to representation, the right to equality, the right to dignity, and you cannot do that unless you're representative of all your workers. But yes, you absolutely have to sensitize from bottom up and top down. And I think, what you don't want is to have people copying existing models because they don't have the time or the energy to think outside the box. And sometimes we need to be thinking outside the box to look at what a sustainable solution to caste discrimination in the workplace would look like. Bina's right, you can do, there are things that you could do anonymously, but at the same time, we are talking about the most vulnerable workers. Now, that's a term that is bandied all over the place by all the labour standards, by the companies who are really keen on doing their proper human rights due diligence. You don't have to look very far in the supply chains in the South Asian context to know those vulnerable workers are going to be from the community. So, let's get out there and start doing what we do. And I think we need to think about the cultural bias and also, there is this thing about mindset. We're not going to change things overnight, but if we could have implementation of regulations, then behaviors would change, which may over time change the mindset. There is no such thing as people from the Dalit community not being qualified enough. How the hell do they know if they're being excluded from actually taking up any positions that they may well be qualified for, but they've already been blacklisted from the recruitment list because the recruiters are already from the dominant caste. So there's lots of cycles to break. There's lots of walls to break down. But, like I said, we wouldn't be around this table if we weren't prepared to do that.
Yeah, and the issue with the recruiters and some of the challenges that come along with recruiters and rights violations is just another angle of this and how this can lead to forced and bonded labor. I want to go around before we get to some audience questions and just hear from you all one more time. Any kind of practical do's or don'ts you want to suggest for companies, particularly around engaging suppliers, engaging in responsible data collection and response, and ensuring that workers' safety is really prioritized. So Sandra, why don't we start with you, and then Bina, and then Mina, and then we'll start going through some of the audience questions.
Yeah, I think we already shared that knowing and from that knowledge enter into conversations. I think that is very important. I think continuing to ask questions and not shying away from difficult topics. Also by not just accepting, no, this is not an issue as the answer, that there's no issue. Just to continue, I think what we talked about with this engagement with civil society organizations, but also to really look at complaints mechanisms, for example, and grievance mechanisms that are in place. So I think it needs to start there from questions, really being interested, but also being critical, and to continue your questions after the first answer. I think that from there you can know more, and then from there you can also look into actions and improvements, so to say.
Yeah, so I mean, you wanted to say something, Andre? Oh, okay.
Just go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to say that, I mean, I agree with a lot that has already been said. I think one of the best examples is what Meena cited of the TTCU, I think allow people to organize and have what is known as difficult dialogues. It is going to be difficult. Nobody's saying it's easy, but those difficult dialogues have to, be converted into something more positive to ensure that, some of these issues are discussed. Second, I would think that have open calls for contracts, rather than giving it to your family. It's a very normal practice here that you give it to somebody you know or somebody from the community that you come, mostly dominant. So have open, fair calls where you can have people applying to get, to be part of, if you have to source products from smaller agencies or companies or organizations, have an open call so people can apply for it. And secondly, I think it's important to have a database, who's doing what, what companies are there, who owns it. Just to put it into perspective for the companies that are here in this room, that it we are 25%, just the indigenous population and Dalits together is 25% of 1.3 billion people. So that's a lot of people. Now, if you look at the data, there's nobody in the CEO level, from this community. So if we are saying that they were fair all along, there should have been at least some directors, some CEOs in these companies. Almost all the lower down the supply chain are from the community. So wherever they are, doing these smaller level jobs at the shop floor or, all that is from this community. So it's very important to also see that the data itself shows how exclusion has happened over the years. And I think we should, instead of perpetuating and instead of, taking this kind of, exclusion forward, we have to, like what Meena says, we have to break those walls. And I'm hoping that, as we move forward, we can have these conversations to break those walls because it is important that we have. And plus, there are a lot of studies that shows the more diversity you have, the better productivity is there. So I think it's also in the interest of profits that it's good to have, people from different communities being part of the workforce.
Absolutely. Meena, anything you'd like to
All
share?
I'd say at this point before we move to the questions is that there are brands, international brands out there. Many use the same suppliers. Why don't, we would welcome a coming together of those. It provides protection in inverted commas, but there is strength in that, in actually coming together to work together to uncover the hidden stakeholders, marginalized women workers. Why, if you keep going down this kind of vaguely parallel path and each brand being a silo, then nothing will change. We know the suppliers are the same, whether they're in Pakistan or whether they're in Bangladesh, whether they're in Sri Lanka, whether they're in India. Everybody uses the same people. So, there is added pressure, to be added by a group of brands doing this. And actually, it would for them, it would facilitate their own solutions and their own ways of moving this forward.
Thanks, Meena. Okay, so on that note, I do want to start going through some of these audience questions, and hopefully we'll have time to get through all of them. So I want to shift back to, Bina's point around the fact that, policies might be in place, but that doesn't mean they're working. So one question we have is, what are the panel's thoughts on the current UGC regulations in India to prevent caste-based discrimination?
I mean, that's a whole different conversation, I would say. So maybe, we can bilaterally, you can share my details, maybe bilaterally have a conversation. But it's appalling that people are just opposing. These rules existed before. It was just placed again, I would say. And then people went on a furor. But it's a different conversation that is relevant in a different realm. So let's talk about it maybe at another time.
Okay, happy to move on from that one. Okay, so I want to focus on the scene in a factory setting. So if we're thinking, we're on the factory floor, um, would the Dalit workers primarily be those who are cleaning? Might they be working on machines? Does this really vary by context? Would love to hear just a little bit more about what this really looks like in a factory setting.
So mostly they're, probably some of them will be, also managing the machines, but, labor work, anything that is hard labor are done by Dalits. Of course, sanitation is almost like a given, like even in offices, companies, not even industrial settings, all the sanitation is done by Dalits, but also hard labor, like also running machineries, etc. Desk work, there are exceptions, so please don't take that, there are no, I'm sitting here and talking to you in English. There are some educated people, there are a lot of educated Dalits have holding positions, but this is not, there are a lot of exceptions, but generally, this is how it is. Desk, computer, accounting, managers are mostly from the dominant caste. But if others would like to add to that, yeah.
I mean, there are machinists. I mean, I think, absolutely there are people in the factories, there are in the textile mills. And yes, as Bina said, it is a given. But when we're talking about, we're still talking about decent working conditions, decent pay, and that's just not it. Because we know of cases, in, when I started working on this within the DSN UK context, it was about what was so-called Sumangali scheme, which was about young women being forced into factories or mills with the promise of a dowry payment at the end. Dowries are illegal, but of a dowry payment at the end. But the way those young women were treated, and many of those women, 80% of those women were from the community. But the way they were treated, and their health and everything else deteriorated so badly, they often wouldn't complete the 3-year contract, so therefore they wouldn't receive the payment. So effectively, it was forced labor. So it's one of those things that you
Mina, you've cut out for me. Are you still with us?
No.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll move on. Hopefully, Mina can rejoin us. But I see another question on here, which is there a network of Dalit-owned factories?
I know there is a Dalit business, it's called Dicky, Dalit of Commerce and something. I forget but there is a collective of Dalit industries, yes.
Okay, so I see a couple of questions on here that we've touched on already. So I might just prioritize some of what we've not yet discussed. Um, going back to the issue of cultural bias, there's a question here. Oh, hi, Mina. Glad you could rejoin. So I'm just shifting to a question kind of about, the selection of auditors and local auditors. So how should, companies address cultural biases, particularly around caste-based culture, when they're selecting local auditors, given that local auditors are preferred for multiple reasons. So how should really a company think about this when they're engaging with local auditors and really local stakeholders in communities where there is cultural bias? Does anyone want to start with that?
I would think that a lot of times when you draft the survey questions for auditors, it has to include some of these terms. It has to include that there's representation from these communities. So it's important how that is framed. But I also think the larger question is of having a policy, an inclusion and diversity policy within the company in the first place, so that anything that any other issue that is discussed will be then discussed based on that policy. Because if the company already has a policy that says that our workforce should have this percentage, or we believe in inclusion and diversity, and therefore not just representation but which levels of representation. So I think always when the audit comes after that, some of these issues will be looked into, according to me. Yeah.
So I'll keep looking through the questions. Feel free to jump in at any time, Mina or Sandra. So go ahead, Sandra.
Maybe still a little bit about the audits and the auditors. I think we have shared some information about the limitations of the audit as such. So I think as a company, like as a company sourcing from South Asian companies, you have your responsibility to look beyond the outcome of the auditing. And I understand that you hire local auditors to do so, but the knowledge of this topic, for example, should provide you with some means to look beyond what comes out and to ask more questions and to engage directly with your supplier, and not only through the audit reports that you receive. So in that way, you can still address topics because it is your responsibility to look into issues that you now know are there. And if they don't come out of your audit, then you need to look further. And I think that is very much very important when it comes to doing business in South Asia and in general, of course.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? I mean, I think most of the people around this table, but also most of the conversations I have, is definitely about going beyond audit. And in fact, what we need to look at is stop using the words audit, stop using the word compliance, and at least move towards the due diligence aspect, because that's what we're looking at, is human rights due diligence. And we need to be thinking about how that can be tackled in supply chains.
So I want to ask a question, which is, what are some common mistakes that you've seen companies make? And so how can companies really actively work to not cause harm when they're trying to act responsibly, but perhaps approaching this in a way that is causing harm? So would anyone like to kind of talk about this a little bit? Bina, maybe we can start with you.
Yes. So sorry, somebody came into my room, so I forgot the question. Can you quickly say again?
Yeah, of course. So I'm trying to understand, what are some of the common mistakes that companies have made? Because we know that sometimes companies want to act responsibly, but actually end up causing more harm than good. So what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen?
So I think some of the common mistakes is that, they don't want to give this a significant importance to this issue. And so all the time, it's like an afterthought. So rather than have preventive measures, you look at what you can do after an incident occurs, or something happens, or some issue happens. So I think it's important that initially itself, that they think of some of these issues that could crop up, and have that, initially itself. It's really important. That I feel is one common miss. Second thing is that there's no one size fits all. Just because something is working in your parent company will not work here, or vice versa. So there has to take the local context into consideration. Here it may be caste, some places it may be minority religion, somewhere else it may be indigeneity. So I think it's important that this one size fits all doesn't work. You'll have to look at what are those common local issues and take that into consideration while making the framework or policy within your country. I think that is one thing. That third, I think that many times when we're talking about human rights violations, and when we're talking about that we want to give a safe, secure space, we don't think about who's the marginalized within the marginalized, and how do we make a space for women from these communities to have more access to some of these jobs, or how can you make it more accessible so that women can be part of this workforce. I think many times, afterwards, when they do a gender audit or something, they realize, oh, there are no women, but women are also not a homogeneous group. So how do we have intersectionality within that? I think some of these things are very commonly done, maybe not out of any spite, but just out of saying, okay, we need to, focus more on profits and how the company is running rather than these things. But at one point, if some of these things actually go out of control, then at that time it will be very difficult to then, address it. So rather think of these issues beforehand and have some measures in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And, of course, if you're dealing with a worker representative group and not the majority of workers are represented by that group, you have to engage with more groups at the end of the day. If you're dealing with a union and it's male led, yet most of the workforce are women, you have to be engaging with women led organizations. So I think that just goes to show, how important it is to build relationships across civil society, with unions as well as other civil society and community group so that you're really engaging with worker leaders who represent a majority of the workers in that supply chain. Go ahead, Bina.
Just one more thing I'd like to add, that I think we also need to stop pretending that we know everything. So companies should stop pretending that, we know it, this is how we've done business in XY country and it's going to work. I think it's important that there are organizations that could support you. There are many Dalit civil society organizations in many of the states in India. You can reach out to them, you can reach out to us, you can reach out to IDSN, Arisa, a lot of organizations like this that can support you in building that kind of a strong framework to ensure that the whole right to protect, promote, respect, all that is taken care of in your frameworks within the company. Thank you.
That's so true. There are so many opportunities to collaborate. So just looking at the time, I want to give everyone just a chance to share any final thoughts or closing remarks. I see one of the questions in the Q&A box is, what would a sustainable solution to caste discrimination in the workplace look like? Feel free to weave that, into your response, but would love to hear from each of you all one more time, just any kind of final thoughts based on the conversation today. Mina, how about we go ahead and start with you, and then we'll hear from Sandra and then Bina.
Lovely. I think just picking up on Bina's thing, we don't have the solutions for everything. There isn't a one size fits all. One has to be really specific. I want to go back to the fact that many brands use the same suppliers. A coming together of brands would be a much more powerful and effective way to look at how to address caste in the supply chain. I often just think, will caste apartheid end in my lifetime? I don't know. As I said, it's just so ingrained in the mind. But unless we start to have regulations that are enforced and implemented, that mindset will continue to do whatever it wants to do in whichever way it wants to do it because nobody is stopping them. So there has to be consequences, and there has to be consequences to actions. And again, from our side at IDSN, I can definitely say we don't have all the answers, but we do have insights and fairly unique insights into the problem so that we can provide help to businesses and help businesses to ask better questions. I mean, I think, events like this, I want to see how we move forward. I don't want us to always just to be a talking shop where, you have your experts around the table, you have wonderful questions, we give wonderful answers, and then at the end of the day, we walk away. So let's work together. We have to start to make that difference, even if it is one small step at a time. And that's it.
Hear, hear. Sandra.
Yeah, thanks, Mina. I support very much what you are saying, and I also would like to, in addition to that, to re-mention what you earlier said about the Dindigul Agreement, because that is an example I think companies could look into of what as a binding agreement that is an example about things that you can do and that you can do jointly with other brands as well that might lead to really improvements in the life of workers, specifically Dalit workers. And I think, I'd like to share examples because it is about trial and error. It is about trying things and then see if things work and then share it with others, hopefully more and more. So in that sense, I would like to invite companies present here, both at the supplier side and at the buyer side, to look into examples like the Dindigul Agreement, but also to look at researches that we all publish, that things that we have been doing, and please share also your examples, but also your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. And Bina, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
Yes, so I'm looking at the numbers. It's really encouraging to see that 556 members of companies are attending this, which means there is an interest. It's really encouraging to see that. But there is a lot of knowledge in this room itself. There's Ambedkar Principles, which IDSN had drafted at many years ago. There's also the guidance note by Arisa, and there are a lot of other knowledge products that we can look at that will help, that we can help collectively. We can do this and help companies and support companies in dealing with some of these very sensitive issues in a way that is more acceptable for many people. So I see a lot of hope, and I hope that the companies also see a lot of hope and take hope from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say really, really thank you so much to all of our speakers. You've shared a wealth of information today. I've went ahead and put my contact information on the screen here, so anyone in the audience can feel free to reach out with additional questions, or if they would like to be connected to one of our speakers here today, or just like in general would like to understand what kind of knowledge, resources, and tools are out there. So we are at time. I do appreciate everyone joining here today. And again, please do not hesitate to reach out. You have my contact information here. And we look forward to building relationships and potentially new collaborations to tackle this issue.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. All right, take care.